So now let's look at the directors. So as you can see, the directors are acting as the primary agent on behalf of the shareholders to determine where does the company should go into which industry, how the company should achieve its objectives and so on. And in particular, there will be two types of directors in your notes. First of all, we've seen that the executive one, they're responsible for the strategy formulation and so on. But also you need to include the non-executive director, such as what we've seen in the unitary board structure. Their roles will be to supervise the executive directors in the first place, making sure that the strategy will be in the best interest of the company as a whole. And of course, we will discuss about the independence of the non-executive directors in a second. But generally speaking, there shouldn't be too many directors in the board. We've seen what do I mean by board is just to be a bubble. So for example, for Tesco PLC, approximately 13 directors. For companies such as the Swire Pacific Limited, a large Hong Kong company, has 18 directors, and smaller listed companies will simply have 6 to 8 directors in place. Because if we have too many directors in the first place, it would really slow down the decision-making process. Even though having lengthy discussion of whether or not we should proceed with decision may be in the best interest of the company, or maybe it cannot, using this decision, it cannot compete with the directors relatively easily. So we have directors, we have the board of directors. So the first thing that we're going to discuss upon is what do the board of directors actually do. And of course, before we move any further, let me just to recap on what do I mean by board. Okay, so we are particularly focusing on the unitary board structure. And we know that on top of this, there would be something called the chairman. On the left-hand side, we've got the executive directors. And normally, the head of the executive director will be the group CEO. And under which there will be for example, different subsidiaries head, for example, CFO and all those subsidiary CEO. Sometimes we can nominate him to be our board of directors and sometimes will not be. Sometimes it simply be the senior management team, the middle line management team. It's entirely up to the company. So for example, let's make it simple. For example, we've got the marketing director, HR directors and so on. Absolutely fine. Sitting on board as acting as a director. On the right hand side, there will be certain non-executive director. Remember, the non-executive directors will only receive the fixed amounts of salary, normally called as the service fee, paying for those non-executive director. And the head of the non-executive director is called the SID, which is the senior independent director, or you can call it SID. Of course, the CEO is the chief executive officer, if you like. Sometimes it's known as the general manager. It's entirely up to the company, different titles that you want. So the head of SID in the non-executive director, and under which there will be different non-executive directors, for example, Mary, Johns, and so on, etc. Okay, so we've got the directors or the non-executive directors. We've got exec and non-exec, so I'm going to use NED for short for non-exec, and S for the executive. The first thing that we're going to discuss upon is what do they tend to do? We know that executive directors and non-executive directors will be responsible for the strategy of the company, making sure we go in the right direction, for example, providing leadership, okay, to the company doing the right thing, and making sure that all of them are effective, and so on, acting in the best interest of the company. We know those bits and pieces. But in the examiner will require you to list some of the points. For example, what are their roles? I'm going to use my personal mnemonics. It's called CSR. So we know CSR is for the corporate social responsibility from an earlier chapter. And now let's detail them down in this one. So the roles of board of directors, for example, first of all is to control the activities within the business, making sure that we've got the good internal control systems in place, making sure that directors will receive the timely information in order to make appropriate decisions in the first place, and also making sure that there will be no fraudulent transactions, making sure the annual report, financial statements will be disclosed appropriately and prepared for appropriately as well. And also responsible for the strategic side of the company, for example, the long-term impact onto the company if you were to do this, and also managing the relationship with the shareholders. That will be absolutely important as well. Updating the shareholders what's going on by holding, for example, the annual general meeting. Sometimes if the shareholders, such as the institutional shareholders, is not happy with the company's performance, they may step into the company and to stop us from doing something wrong. For example, by passing the resolution, either it will be ordinary or special resolution. Absolutely fine. Alternatively, disclosing the annual report, financial statement to those shareholders would be the dialogue with the shareholders, the dialogue with the shareholder to update them what's going on within the company. So to manage the relationship with the shareholders as well. So not just for the internal operation of the business when structuring your answer, but also to the shareholder, managing the relationship. That would be absolutely important. Making sure the shareholders will trust the company so it can attract more funds and we can stabilize our share price, for example. So those would be the roles of the board of directors, just the mnemonic CSR for you to remember them. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to ask ourselves, if you look at the board here, so whether or not we should separate the roles between the chairman and the CEO. Should they be the same person or separate people? Well, I can hear different answers. So some of them will say, right, they should be the same person. And some of the students will simply say, okay, they should be separated. Well, that's absolutely fine, because in the UK, according to the best practice, according to UK Corporate Governance Code, it should be separated. But in the USA, for example, they can be the same person. So we are going to talk about this on to the next page of the note. So first of all, if you argue that they should not be the same person, what are your reasons? So for example, you can argue that the chairman is a representative of the shareholders only. So that means they should not involve in the actual business decision-making process, although he's responsible in running the board, making sure the directors are effective and the non-executive directors are independent. It's simply because if the chairman is acting as the CEO, surely the chairman may receive, for example, the shares, and sometimes, for example, share options, performance-related pay, and so on. So they may not act in the best interest of the company. So the chairman will simply, okay, because I've got shares, I've got share options, so I'm going to do is any of these problems inside the company, I'm not going to disclose that to the shareholder, but rather I'm going to dump my shares first of all before I disclose this fact to the shareholders. So that's it. So that's the argument to split the role between the chairman and CEO. And also, as I said, we have to make sure CEO and management team are effective and competent, and also the non-executive directors are independent. So by mixing the roles together, this might not be the case, but we can ensure that's to happen. And also, by splitting the roles, we can reduce the self-interest from the chairman's perspective, because the chairman is not allowed to receive the performance-related pay in the company. Of course, some of the chairmen will receive tiny little shares from the company, a small amount of shares in the company. That's absolutely fine, but they can't receive the performance-related pay, such as the short-term bonuses or long-term share options. So, but we can argue that in the USA, we've actually mixed the roles together. They will be the same person. So why this will be the case then? So for example, if you split them off, there will be two bosses. So the unity problem comes in. Which boss should I listen to? Ultimately, this will certainly have an impact. For example, the conflict between these two roles, because I need to be a boss, but another will say, I need to be a boss, but which one to be a boss? And also, for example, the CEO needs to report to the chairman timely, so the chairman would know exactly what's the company's going on within the organization. But if this is not the case, the chairman would not know this issue, and hence if you split the roles, that means if the CEO does not report to the chairman what's going on, the chairman does not receive the timely information, maybe the chairman may fail to challenge the CEO in the first place. If that's the case, then the company as a whole will not benefit from this, so we need to mix them together. So you can argue that, okay, splitting the roles is the recommendation by the UK Corporate Governance Code. Mixing the roles together, absolutely fine. This is allowed in the USA. So there'll be arguments for this, and there'll be advantages for this as well. You need to be able to comment on those in the exam. So, looking back to our board, we got the executive and also we got the non-executive one. So the next thing that we're going to do is, first of all, we're going to discuss upon the roles, first of all, for chairman. And then we look at the roles of the CEO. And then we're going to look at the roles of the seat, is the senior independent directors. And then we're going to see the general roles of different non-executive directors. And finally, we're going to discuss about the independence of the non-executive directors as well. So let's see then, on to the next page of the notes for chairman's role. So before we look at the mnemonic, first of all, the chairman is responsible for running the board and representing the shareholders. And that means it's entirely up to the chairman mainly to discuss about different issues with the shareholders, rather than allowing any of these non-executive directors to do so. It's up to the chairman to do that, really. So the roles of the chairman, I'm going to use mnemonics for this, it's called bins. It's like the dustbin, yeah? We simply throw everything to the chairman. It's up to the chairman to collect all this information and communicate with the shareholders. That's the idea behind the bins. So first of all, but actually the chairman is not the dustbin. Don't get me wrong, but just use the mnemonics for this to help you understand these issues. So first of all, the chairman relating to the board is acting as the leader of the board, making sure the board is effective, making sure the directors are competent in the first place, non-executive directors are independent. And also the chairman is responsible for setting up the board's agenda, which means discussing the things, what should be discussed. In a board meeting, that will be absolutely important. For example, the priority number 1, 2 and 3. What sorts of things that needs to be addressed first before the second one. And also, we're going to promote the culture of the openness and debating board, which means the chairman is responsible for challenging any of these decisions that a company is going to adopt. For example, the CEO will say, I'm going to build up a swimming pool in this particular area. So chairman should be able to challenge the CEO about that decision, its validity. And also providing training to those board members, especially for new coming non-executive directors. They may not know what the company is currently doing. Okay, I'm going to provide you with the training program. And also chair all of these meetings and ensure that the board meetings take place on a regular basis. And of course, if you Google, for example, Tesco PLC and the report, you will see where not the chairman is actually doing that. So for example, the annual report itself under the UK corporate governance section, it will disclose the number of meetings that held by chairman and the, for example, where not the chairman appears in all of these meetings. And of course, sometimes the chairman will not appear in the meeting. That's absolutely fine, but the company secretary as well as the senior independent director will come into being. So, sixth one is we're going to ensure that we're going to appraise the performance of the board members on an annual basis, making sure that they're exercising their roles, having sufficient time to discharge their duties, especially for non-executive directors. So making sure that they meet with the requirements stated into the contract in the first place. So dealing with the board. Secondly, dealing with the information as well. So as the chairman, we have to make sure that all of his board members will receive the useful information, accurate one, timely one, and clear information, absolutely important, and relevant information, in order to make sure that this, for example, CEO will make timely information. And thirdly, to non-executive directors, for example, holding separate meetings with the non-executive director to discuss upon the performance of the executive one. And also if the executive director and non-executive directors have some of the conflict. So that chairman will act as the casting vote. To the decision that a company is going to adopt. So it's going to make. So for example, we've got 5 executive and 5 non-executive there. 5 says yes, we should do this. 5 says no, we should not do that. So now the chairman will come in, acting as the casting vote, because the chairman's got 1 vote, and he say, okay, I'm going to say, right, I'm going to vote for yes. So the decision needs to go ahead. If the chairman will vote for no, surely we're going to stop that decision from going ahead. So that's the idea behind it. And of course, the chairman, without the non-executive director, should hold the CEO into account, which means should challenge any of this decision that the CEO proposed to do. So if the chairman fails to do that, in some of the questions that the exam will give you a scenario where the chairman is afraid of challenging the CEO because the CEO is so powerful. So if that's the case, then the chairman is not acting as the roles of the chairman. Okay, we should sack him, for example, or sack her. So fourthly, dealing with the shareholders, because as I said, the chairman, very, very importantly, will be a representative of the shareholder. Primarily, it's up to the chairman to communicate any issues directly to the shareholders, for example, in the annual general meeting, holding separate meetings, and so on. So it represents the company to the shareholders, primarily dealing with the shareholders, but from a CEO's perspective, the CEO will be primarily dealing with other stakeholders, such as the customers and so on. So from a chairman's perspective, we need to have the effective communication with the shareholders. For example, in the chairman's statement, if you download the annual report of any of his publicly listed companies, for example in the UK, you will see the chairman's statement informing whether or not the company is doing a good job or a bad job. And of course, if the chairman's statement within that chairman's statement, it said, our company is having a difficult year. Ultimately, this will have an impact on the share price immediately after it's published. And also dialogue with different shareholders. For example, if the institutional shareholder is not happy with the company's performance, the institutional shareholders will simply have a meeting with the chairman directly and asking the chairman what's going on within the company, why it's not doing a good job, and so on. So, as you can see, the chairman's role, we can divide that into bins, talking about the board of directors, talk about the information required, talk about the net, as well as the shareholder. So, the next role, as we can see, is the Chief Executive Officer's role. It's the CEO's role. Particularly, we are talking about the group CEO as the director. Of course, you can argue for some of the CEOs, such as the CEO in the subsidiary, may not be the board member. Absolutely fine. So the CEO, as you can see, will be responsible for the strategy of the company and responsible for other stakeholders such as the customers and governments and so on. But the examiner sometimes will require you to list or describe the roles of a CEO and being able to apply that to the actual case, because the examiner will give you a case where the CEO is not acting as his role appropriately and asking you to criticize them, so on. So if that's the case, then I'm going to provide you with the personal mnemonic is to bribe other stakeholders. We know that other stakeholders would deal with the customers, important customers and governments and so on. Bribe other stakeholders. Of course, we know that bribe is not a good thing. It's absolutely banned. It's absolutely not allowed when we are conducting our business. Bribery is absolutely wrong. So bribe other stakeholders, so that would be the idea behind it. CEO's role. But we can't bribe, it's just to be a mnemonic. So first of all, B for business strategy. For example, formulating a strategic CSR, it would be our strategy. Deciding which industry that we need to go into, that would be a strategy. Deciding the pricing decision for a company, that would be a strategy as well. Deciding which product we should produce, which market we should go into, that will be our strategy as well. So that will be the B. The R, on the other hand, for the risk management. It's very, very important for a CEO to establish the sound internal control system in the first place and manage the different risks appropriately. So in most of the circumstances, we cannot be in a monopoly position in the marketplace. So what do I mean by monopoly? Is we cannot be the single supplier of the single resources in the marketplace. So if that's the case, then we need to accept certain level of business risks that we're currently facing. So for example, the risk that these products may be out of date, the technology will change, and hence the product demand will fall, and so on. Risk is not always the bad thing, because for example, there'll be 30% of chance that the risk will take place and the company will suffer loss. And that means another 70% of chance that this risk may not happen, and we've got the opportunity to earn lots of money out of it. So you need to manage the risks appropriately, and don't worry, we're going to start a separate chapter later on to discuss about the risk management. But you can argue that it's the primary responsibility for a CEO to establish a good internal control system to make sure that the fraudulent transactions will not happen within the company, and making sure that the CEO would manage the risks appropriately as well. And also the CEO is responsible for the investment as well as the financing decision of the company. And of course you can argue that for some of the large companies, they will have the treasury function. The treasury function responsible for the financial management, or you can call it the management accounting stuff. For example, which project we should invest our money into, how we're going to get money. For example, either going to list our company onto the stock exchange directly, or alternatively, we simply borrow some money from the bank. So CEO responsible for investment as well as financing of the business is absolutely important. And also making recommendation to what sort of executive directors that we need to employ. So of course, later on in the section we discussed about different types of committee. So one of them will be the nomination committee. So responsible for the recruitment of the directors to a company. Of course, the CEO will be responsible for giving the recommendations of what sort of directors the company should employ. For example, we lack of good quality finance director. We lack of good quality marketing director. So we can make recommendations to them. And also, the CEO is responsible for reviewing the performance of the board. For example, one of the board members is the marketing director. He's not performing a good job, and hence the CEO would make recommendations to the board to sack that marketing director. Absolutely fine. And then recruits the new one. And also CEO, as you can see, the final ones, they are the stakeholders dealing with, for example, the major supplier. What is the suppliers that we're going to use? Supply chain management, major customer to look after the corporate customers, for example, dealing with the bank, maintain the good relationship, for example, and also the government. But remember, we cannot bribe the government in this particular paper. So those are the CEO's roles, as you can see. So we discussed about the roles of the chairman. We used the mnemonic called BINS. We've used the mnemonic for the roles of the CEO is to bribe other stakeholders. And now let's look at the SID, which is the Senior Independent Director. So the idea behind the SID is this. We have to make sure that the Senior Independent Director on the right-hand side of the bubble will be absolutely independent. And for example, if you're not happy with the CEO or the CFO or some of the directors, and also if you're not happy with the chairman, because if you were to communicate with the shareholder, you need to go through the chairman. And it's up to the chairman to communicate this issue to the shareholder. But what if you're not happy with the chairman? Surely, instead of holding a meeting with the shareholder, between chairman and shareholder, now the non-executive directors can directly communicate this issue to the senior independent director. It's up to the senior independent director to hold a separate meeting with the shareholder and discussing about the poor performance of the chairman or maybe other directors directly with the shareholder. So senior independent director especially is acting as an alternative discussion channel with the shareholder. So for on to the next 2 pages, first of all, the Senior Independent Director, I'm going to use the mnemonic for this is called PIC. It's like picture, isn't it? So you're going to draw a big picture of what's going on within a company and updates the shareholders about the big picture of the organisation. So first of all, related to performance, mainly we are talking about the performance of the chairman. So particularly, we're going to hold the meeting separately with other non-executive directors. So together with the SEED, we're going to discuss about the performance of the chairman, whether or not the chairman is exercising his or her role appropriately. Because if this is not the case, okay, I'm going to advise for example, the shareholders to sack the chairman directly. And also we're going to discuss upon whether or not the chairman can be the chairman in the next year. If this is not the case, who will be the next vice chairman. So talking about the succession planning as well. So that's what I mean by performance of the chairman. Second I, because we talk about pick, is the intermediary. So sometimes that the executive and non-executive directors will have conflicts amongst each other. And the chairman is not available, absolutely fine. So the seat will come into being, who chairs the meeting, for example, on behalf of the chairman. So acting as the intermediary for other directors where necessary, holding separate meeting on behalf of the chairman. And also the seat will act as the channels of communication, which means that the non-executive director is not happy with the chairman or CFO and so on. He can go to the seat, it's up to the seat to hold a meeting with the shareholders directly. So that's the idea behind this, the alternative channel. So you talked about picked already. So now let's discuss about the roles of the non-executive directors as well. We know that the non-executive director, they cannot receive the performance-related pay from a company in the form of short-term bonuses or long-term share options. So they are responsible for the sensitive areas. For example, if you don't have the non-executive director, but we only have the CEO, CFO and so on, and now we are considering, okay, in our board, in order to build up more power, I'm going to recruit my family member, for example my wife, to be a director as well in the board. So if that's the case, then this may not be in the best interest of a company. And that's the reason why the non-executive directors should step into this process, for example the recruitment of the potential new director, to make sure they're competent and make sure, for example, if you're going to recruit the non-executive director, they're also independent as well. So the roles of the non-executive directors, I'm going to use a person mnemonics for this, is called PRSS. No meaning for that, but PRSS. First sensitive area is called people role. So that means it's dealing with the recruitment, a removal of the directors in the first place. Deciding the payment to the executive director, because the executive directors should not set their own pay, because if you allow them to set their own pay, they like to pay for themselves as much as possible. And also the non-executive director will be allocated to the nomination committee as well as the remuneration committee setting up the payment. Of course, we will discuss about the concept called committee in the later sections. So that's the people role. Secondly, the non-executive directors will be responsible for the risk role, making sure that a company would manage the risks appropriately, making sure that the internal control system is sound. So the non-executive directors will be allocated to a risk committee and also the audit committee as well. And also non-executive directors, as I said, should be held responsible or collectively responsible together with the executive director for the strategy of a company. So having a strategy role as well. Collectively responsible with the strategy and also being able to challenge any of this strategy their company is going to adopt. So if the non-executive director fails to do that, we need to hold that non-executive director accountable for this or responsible for this. And finally, for scrutiny role. And that means we have to make sure that the performance of the executive directors are good. If that's not the case, of course, we're going to sack them. So we're going to allow the shareholders to sack them, for example. So we need to scrutinize the executive director's performance, for example, in the form of annual reports, in the form of financial statements, making sure that you've got good performance, for example. So the non-executive directors under the scrutiny role will be allocated into the audit committee. Of course, we will discuss about that committee issues in a separate chapter. So far that we discussed about the concept, first of all, for the CEO, for the chairman, we use mnemonics for this. It's called BINS. For example, board of directors information, net as well as the shareholder relationship. Secondly, we talked about the roles of the CEO. We use a mnemonic called bribe. Other stakeholders, but actually we can't bribe. For example, we talk about the business strategy, risk management, investment and financing, the board committee's advice and evaluation of the performance of the board of directors, and dealing with the relationship with other stakeholders. We also talked about the roles of the senior independent director. We use a mnemonic for this, it's called PIC. For example, performance of the chairman, discussing about the session planning issues of the chairman as well. The intermediary, holding a separate meeting and acting as the alternative communication channel. And also we discussed about the roles of the non-executive directors in general. It's called PRWS mnemonic. People role, risk role, and also strategy as well as the scrutiny role. So as you can see, those are the roles of different directors, and I hope you're absolutely happy about it. But for the later two, they are the non-executive directors really, but the head of which is called SID. And the chairman will be a non-exec as well in the UK, most likely. So when talking about the non-executive directors, it is absolutely important for you to, first of all, how we're going to recruit the non-executive directors. So of course, we're going to recruit the non-executive directors tend to be the directors with different background, coming from different industries, for example. Having relevant experience, for example. At the same time, we have to make sure that the non-executive director would be independent. Because suppose that we've got a good relationship between the non-exec and the exec. Because they're friends. If that's the case, it's highly unlikely for a non-executive director to oversee the performance of the executive one in the first place. You agree with that? And that's the reason why we need to promote the independence of the non-executive director. So if you turn on to the next page of the note, we'll see the non-exec's independence. So the non-exec should not be the employee in the last 5 years of this company. If this is not the case, the non-exec will not be independent. And also no material business relationships with the company in the last 3 years. So as you can see, we use the word material. It's not talking about the books and journals and so on, but it's talking about important or vital. For example, if you got, for example, a contract with the company more than $2 million or $5 billion, $1 billion, that will be material business relationships. But if you simply, for example, buy a product from a company, for example, in Dell, buy the computer from the Dell company for just, let's say, $1,000, that will not be a material business relationship. So the way they're going to define the materiality or importance will really depend. And also, acting as the non-executive director, you should only receive, for example, the basic salary, possibly with small amounts of shares, absolutely allowed, but you cannot receive the performance-related pay. The performance-related pay will be the short-term bonuses as well as the, for example, long-term share options. So just a quick idea of what do I mean by share options. Share option is the option allowing someone to buy or sell the share at a particular price. So for example, I'm going to give you a share option. Allow you to buy the share at $1 in 5 years' time. So in 5 years' time, you can exercise that share option to buy the share of the company at $1. If you can grow that share price up in 5 years' time, because your performance is relatively good, and the share price at 5 years' time is to be $10. That means you can buy at $1, you can immediately sell it at $10 in 5 years' time in the open market, and you will have the capital gain of $9. What if I'm going to give you 100 share options? Each share option can buy, let's say, 1 million shares. So if that's the case, you can calculate how much profit or how much capital gain that you've earned if you were to exercise this. So, and also no close family relationships to a company. For example, if you're acting as the non-executive director, you cannot be the wife of the CEO, for example. And also no cross-directorships as well. So what do I mean by cross-directorship? As you can see in the bottom, separately describe the cross-directorship. So that means, for example, we've got two companies here. Company 1 as well as Company 2. So for example, John is the executive director of the Company 1. And John, if is the non-executive director, in the Company 2, that's absolutely fine. But cross-directorship means if the Company 2 is the executive director, such as Lucy, if Lucy is the non-executive director in the Company 1. If that's the case, this is not allowed. Because as you can see, I mean, I'm not saying this is, I can't say this is not allowed, but it will really impair the independence of the non-executive director, and that non-executive director should be removed. Because you can argue, okay, if John, for example, acting as the executive in the Company 1 but non-executive in Company 2, John will simply help Lucy, for example, setting up the payment to Lucy when deciding the remuneration package to Lucy in the Company 2, and in return, Lucy in the Company 1, acting as a non-exec, will help with the executive director such as John in the first place, because you're helpmate in the first place, so that's the reason why I'm going to help you out. So if that's the case, then any of this decision that John or Lucy is going to make would not be based upon the best interest of the company, but rather based upon whether or not you've helped me before. So if that's the case, I'm going to help you out. So that's what I mean by cross-directorship. So if that's the case, that non-executive director is not independent. And also, if acting as the non-executive director more than 9 years in that particular company is not independent as well, and that needs to be removed. Cannot be a major shareholder, but absolutely yes, you can hold certain shares, because for example you're going to buy some shares, for example buy 10 shares, 100 shares of that company, absolutely fine, but you cannot be a major shareholder, you cannot control the company. So finally, there should be at least 50% of the non-exec, excluding a chairman. So that means, for example, in the unitary board in particular, the chairman will act as the casting vote, and there should be a bottom line, exec and non-exec, at least 50% of split. There shouldn't be more of these executive directors than the non-exec one. And that means absolutely fine. You can say, well, 40% here and 60% there, absolutely fine. but you cannot swap the way around. 60% here and 40% there. This is not allowed. 50 and 50% would be the bottom line, excluding a chairman. Okay? So that is the independence issues related to the net, and hope you're absolutely happy about it. And of course, finally, we'd like to discuss about whether or not we need to have the non-executive director. You can argue that when employing the non-executive director, it's relatively difficult to ensure that non-executive director is competent at the same time is independent. So if that's the case, then advantages and disadvantages then. Advantage, surely the non-executive director will provide expertise to the company, helping companies to grow its business. Yes, this happens quite a lot, because the non-executive directors will have certain experience in other industries, for example, or in the same industry that you're currently operating in. And also monitoring the board of directors to stop their excessive behavior, some of the greedy behaviors. Even though sometimes even those the company is not doing a good job, the directors himself will pay for himself for large amounts of bonuses and so on, such as the Lehman Brothers, which has already collapsed in the USA. And also, having the non-executive directors, we can make sure to some extent, I say to some extent, if they're independent and exercising their role, to make sure that the decision is in the best interest of the shareholder as a whole and representing the shareholders appropriately, not allowing the executive directors to steal the money from the shareholders in the first place. But you can argue there will be certain disadvantages of the non-executive directors. First of all, it's quite costly. Although we pay for them fixed amounts of salary, but if you look at the annual report, I suggest you to do that. Download the annual report for certain public listed companies. You will see the total payment to those non-executive directors. We'll discuss about that when we come to the remuneration chapter. And also we'll slow down the decision-making process, because having too many non-executive directors in the first place, such as Tesco PLC, now they've got more of these non-executive directors than the executive one. And hence, they keep challenging the decision that's made by the executive one and slow down the overall decision-making process. And also you can argue that whether or not the decision would be appropriate or not appropriate. So, because the non-executive director, they might not have relevant experience in the same industry that you're currently operating in. So we can argue that for Tesco PLC currently, they don't have many of these non-executive directors having experience in the retail industry. And hence, for example, the non-exec may keep challenging the decision, may keep voting for no, 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 you shouldn't do this, but actually slow down the decision-making process. At the same time, their decision may not be correct. So it's absolutely important for the chairman to set up for example, the induction program to provide the training to those non-executive directors with the help of the company secretary. Of course, we'll discuss about that in a second, don't worry. So far that we've looked at in this particular section for the roles of different directors, for example, the chairman, CEO, non-exec, as well as the senior independent director. I've also discussed the independence of the non-executive directors and the pros and cons of the non-executive directors as well. So that's the end of this section, and I hope you're absolutely happy with it. So study hard. There are quite lots of things that you have to remember really. You have to work really, really hard in order to pass this paper. So I'm going to stop here and look forward to seeing you in the next of our section then.
APC, accounting for your future.